Just going to have to wait.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Cindy Harris, the Volunteer Services Liaison for the City of Grapevine Parks and Recreation Department. I help oversee volunteers for the Parks and Recreation Department and work with Kathy Nelson, the Executive Director of Keep Grapevine Beautiful, to help plan and organize programming for Keep Grapevine Beautiful. We are pleased that you have joined us for our first Eco Talk of 2022. We are looking forward to having, I believe that we'll have 8 Eco Talks this year, and those are planned, and we're really looking forward to it. This month's Eco Talk was moved to a virtual setting because of the pandemic, and we appreciate you guys being flexible and joining us tonight. Just a couple housekeeping points. Chat is turned off. If you have a question, please go right ahead once you think about it, post it in the Q&A, and Dan will address questions at the end of the presentation. Again, feel free to post those as he presents, and we'll address those at the end. I'm going to read you Dan's bio. Dan Moulton is a wildlife ecologist with a BA in biology and an MS in wildlife ecology. He also has a PhD in wildlife science. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis-St. Paul. He is recognized as a certified wildlife biologist by the Wildlife Society. He has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Hawaii and Maryland, the Maryland Wildlife Administration in Annapolis, and for over 20 years at Texas Parks and Wildlife in Austin. His work at TPWD focused on wetland ecosystems all over Texas, but especially coastal wetlands. And after retirement from TPWD, he taught for over 6 years as an adjunct professor of environmental science and biology at several colleges in the Dallas area. And he presently serves as the executive committee chair of the Dallas Sierra Club. So Dan, at this point, I will turn the screen over to you, and you can begin your presentation, please.
Okay, let me see if I can. All right, it's working now. Good evening, fun seekers. We're going to talk about the pesticide dilemma tonight. Why is this a dilemma? It's a dilemma because pesticides do good things as well as bad things. Sometimes we forget about that. The opening picture here shows a bug vacuum. Here, the guy is holding strawberries in his hands. They use that machine to actually vacuum bugs off the plants instead of using chemicals. And we'll talk more about other methods of control later. So, who uses pesticides? 85% of the estimated 2.9 million tons that are used each year is used by big ag. And highly developed nations are using 75% of all pesticides. However, the use of pesticides is increasing most rapidly in the developing countries because they need more food desperately. What is a pesticide? Well, actually, it's something that kills pests, right? But we have first generation pesticides, inorganic compounds, for example, lead, mercury, arsenic. You know, before they harvest cotton, they spray the fields with arsenic, and that kills the leaves of the plants and makes it easier for the machines to harvest the cotton. You have botanicals, which is products derived from plants, nicotine, pyrethrin. Pyrethrin comes from the chrysanthemum flowers, and this is a field of commercial chrysanthemums in some African country. It escapes me at the moment. What are second generation pesticides? Well, you have the synthetic botanicals pyrethroids chemically mimic pyrethrum. You have DDT, which of course is a synthetically created organic compound. Here's a picture from 1945 taken at Jones Beach State Park on Long Island, New York. The sign on the side says it's a powerful insecticide, harmless to human beings. And as you can see, they are fogging this beach. The purpose would be to control mosquitoes. So what are the major group of insecticides that are chemicals designed to kill insects? You have chlorinated hydrocarbons. That means you have hydrocarbon chains that have chlorine groups attached. And DDT is an example of a chlorinated hydrocarbon. Organophosphates have phosphate groups attached. For example, malathion. Some of these are really quite toxic, but usually do not last as long in the environment. Carbamates is another group. What are the major kinds of herbicides? That's a chemical designed to kill some kind of plant. You have the selective herbicides. For example, 2,4-D is designed to kill broadleaved plants. You have 2,4,5-T, which we also call Agent Orange, which, as many of you who are old enough know, was sprayed in the jungles of Vietnam to defoliate the entire jungle so that they could see the Viet Cong moving around better. You also may realize that Agent Orange had very adverse effects on many Vietnam veterans. Non-selective herbicides. An example is the glycophosphate Roundup. And many of you may be aware that Monsanto, who makes Roundup, is being sued for millions of dollars because Roundup has been shown to be involved in causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and perhaps other cancers as well. So what are some of the benefits and the problems that come from pesticides? You know, pesticides were invented because there was a perceived need. And one of those needs was to control insect vectors of disease. This is a map that shows you where malaria occurs in the world. And as you might have guessed, it's basically in the tropics and the subtropics around the globe. The World Health Organization estimates that there are 300 million to 500 million humans on the planet who are suffering from malaria. They also estimate that about 2.7 million people die every year from malaria, and the majority are youngsters in, developing nations. So if you live in these areas, some chemical to control mosquitoes is quite a benefit. Another benefit is the production of food crops. It is estimated that farmers can save between $3 and $5 in crops for every dollar they invest into pesticides. Also, pests eat or destroy more than 1/3 of the world's food crops. Modern ag, big time ag, does monocultures, where you'll have fields of the same thing, such as corn. And these agricultural ecosystems are very oversimplified, and they're very vulnerable because these ecosystems lack natural controls on the pest species. Natural controls such as predators, disease organisms, and parasites that would normally be there to help control the pest that you're worried about. Here's a problem with the use of pesticides: the evolution of genetic resistance. Okay, so here's a chart that shows the number of species exhibiting genetic resistance to pesticides. These are insects and mite species. So you can see after World War II, when they began to use pesticides in large quantities, the number of species exhibiting resistance climbed steadily. This phenomenon creates what is called a pesticide treadmill. You apply your pesticide to the crops. The pesticide kills most of the pests, but not all of them. The resistant ones are the ones that survive. Okay? The numbers of the resistant ones then increase. Now you have a new population of genetically resistant pests. So now you increase your pesticide application. Okay, so the same thing is going to happen again, right? And now you get into this syndrome where you apply more and more pesticide and you keep getting these resistant individuals. So what can we do about this to manage this resistance? Well, one thing is you can create a refuge. That's an area in the field where no pesticide is applied. And the purpose of that would be to allow the normal predators, parasites, and disease organisms to persist in those refuges so that they can move out into the crop where you are having the pest problem. You can avoid the repeated use of the same pesticide. This is not something that has been done widely because it's more expensive than just buying what you can get and putting in large amounts and using it. Okay, this is another problem, is imbalances in the ecosystem. Here's a chart that shows the percentage of crops lost annually to pests in the United States. And I think the take-home lesson here is 42 to 51 is just after World War II, before the widespread use of pesticides in big ag. You can see what's happening with insects. You're worse off now than we were before we started using the pesticide. The same is true with diseases, and it's all because of resistance. Weeds, the situation is a little bit better. Here's a problem that demonstrates imbalances in the ecosystem. You can create new pests. Those oranges are suffering from red scale. This is caused by an insect, okay, and this ruins the fruit. Now, if you look at the graph, I think that graph is about lemon trees. What it shows is that a lot of DDT treatment has caused the problem to get worse. In the uncontrolled trees, the problem remained the same, and it wasn't. You can see the economic injury level was not exceeded. When they started to use tremendous amounts of pesticide, this red scale mite became a big problem. And it wasn't before, and it caused a lot of damage on lemons, oranges, other citrus. Okay, another problem with pesticides is what happens when they get out into the environment, okay? You get persistence, bioaccumulation, biological magnification. Let's take a quick look at what that means. If you look down at the bottom of this figure, you can see that in the water, the DDT is at a tremendously low level. You see that 0.00005 parts per million. But look what happens as you climb up the food chain. Each time you go up one level on the food chain, these are called trophic levels, the percentage increases of the pesticide, of the DDT in that animal. When you get to the top here, and in this case, we're talking about the ring-billed gull, which they're saying is at the top trophic level. And actually there may be levels above this where the problem would be worse, let's say bald eagles. you've got 75.5 parts per million. That has concentrated what was in the water 1.5 million times. Okay, so this is the problem that caused Rachel Carson. Many of you have heard of Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring. It was published in 1963. The term Silent Spring referred to the fact that she was worried that birds were going to be killed by this pesticide and that we might have a spring when there was no birds singing. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist, worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, wrote another excellent little book called The Sea Around Us. Read it if you get a chance. Well, this book created quite a brouhaha. The pesticide people tried to discredit Rachel Carson, but eventually it was realized that she was right. And that is one of the reasons why certain species became endangered, such as the bald eagle, which eats a lot of dead fish, actually, and live fish. Mobility in the environment. Well, okay, so we won't spend too much time. This looks kind of complicated. It's not that complicated. Your intended pathway is you want to spray this pesticide from the air and you want it to go on your crop and you want to get rid of your target pest. But what happens? In the air, it gets off into streams, lakes, rivers. In the soil, it can eventually get into fresh water and even the ocean. And on the harvest, it gets on your food. So that's one way you can get it. Also, it gets into animals that are eating these food crops or grains, and you can get it into your body that way in your food. It creates a problem in the oceans, in freshwater systems, because it concentrates in fish and other aquatic organisms. So this is a problem in the environment in general. What about risks to human health? Short-term effects of pesticides on human health. If you handle food that has pesticide residue on it, such as ag workers in particular, because they're handling tremendous amounts of this food every day, there will be health consequences. And we'll talk about those in a minute. Short-term effects of pesticides. Some of you may remember the Bhopal disaster. Bhopal is a city in India. Union Carbide had a plant there. They allowed 40 tons of this methyl isocyanate gas to be released. More than 500,000 people were exposed. 2,500 killed immediately, 2,500 more killed through time. 50,000 to 60,000 have serious health problems. Okay. Here in the US, the EP estimates that pesticides poison about 67,000 people per year. The World Health Organization estimates that globally, pesticides poison more than 4 million people per year. Of those, about 300,000 die. So if you're one of the 300,000, then this is a serious problem. More risks, long-term effects. We all know about there's a potentially higher risk of cancer. There are problems with sterility, particularly in male organisms. In the female, there's a problem with miscarriages and birth defects. And we now know that Parkinson's disease is also a potential risk from pesticides. What are some alternatives to the use of pesticides? There are many cultivation methods that have been designed to try to control pests. Interplanting a mixture of plants. This is when you don't plant the same thing in entire large fields, but you plant different rows of different crops. Now, this doesn't lend itself very well to big ag. because this takes time and that means money. Strip cutting is where you cut strips of some crop like alfalfa. And then this gives a chance for the control organisms in the uncut strips to work on the pests. The simple planting at the right time and fertilizing and irrigating at the right time makes for healthier crops, which means they're more resistant to the pests themselves. Crop rotation is something that is done by Big Ag. That is, you don't plant the same crop every year in the same fields, but you try to rotate. This also is a soil management technique. Some crops are harder on the soil than other crops. More alternatives. What about biological controls? What is a biological control? It's the use of naturally occurring diseases, parasites, or predators to control a pest. So you're actually using another animal or insect or a disease organism to try to control your pest. You can, on a small level, you can do this. You know, you can go to your nursery and you can buy ladybugs, ladybird beetles to put on in your garden, and they will control aphids because they suck the juice right out of the aphids. That's an example of the use at a small level. Pheromones and hormones. A pheromone is basically a hormone that is carried through the air and sensed by other organisms, and it attracts them usually. It's related to mating cycles. So they can use pheromones to attract insects to traps where they would be killed. Synthetic hormones can induce abnormal development, and that can interfere with the natural reproductive cycle of the pest. Reproductive controls, what do you mean? Well, the best example of this is probably the sterile male technique, where you flood the pest population with a large number of sterile males. Probably the two best examples of this are the control of the screwworm fly in the southern US. Screwworms used to be a very serious pest on livestock, cattle. The larvae would actually eat the flesh of the livestock. So they released millions and millions and millions of sterile male screwworm flies, and it basically solved the problem. Another example is in California with the Mediterranean fruit fly, where they did the same tactic. And it worked pretty well too. More alternatives. You have genetic controls. The use of genetically modified plants is often a tactic to try to control pests. A case in point would be this BT, stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria. And when it infects some insects, it kills them. It has potential and it has problems. Corn has been genetically modified to produce this BT toxin on its own. Okay, so you don't have to worry about, say, spraying the bacillus bacteria onto your crops. The plant will produce it for you. Okay. One of the problems that we know about now is that once the plant produces that toxin, it can affect non-target species. And the one of most concern is the monarch butterfly. And then you have quarantine, which I don't think we'll talk about. So generally speaking, the goal in pest management is to use what's called IPM, integrated pest management. There's a variety of tools that we've talked about. Resistant crop varieties, that comes through genetic modification of the crop plant. Natural enemies, parasites, diseases, and predators, the pheromone traps, judicious use of pesticides, and then the various cultivation practices. Here's an example of rice production in Indonesia. And if you look at this, Gigi, excuse me a second, Gigi, stop. My dog is guarding the house. Okay, sorry. Rice production in Indonesia. The green line is the rice production. And the red line is the use of pesticides. When they started using integrated pest management, where the arrow is there, you can see that their use of pesticides was able to be dropped significantly, and yet the rice production continued to climb. So this is just an advantage of using IPM over simply using a pesticide. Irradiating foods, well, this is really something kind of different, you know, that this prevents bacteria and viruses on meats. It kills microorganisms. I don't know, that doesn't seem to fit in well. Let's briefly just take a look at the laws that control pesticide use. They go way back, 1938. The Delaney Clause had to do with cancer-causing substances being regulated. And then FIFRA, as it's called. And here is a little chart that we'll talk about that estimates the risk of cancer from pesticide residues. And actually, look at the chart now. Cancer risk is deaths from cancer. So how do we interpret this? 8.8 times 10 to the 4 means that from eating tomatoes, there's 8.8 people out of 10,000 will die from cancer due to the pesticides on the tomatoes. And the levels drop. That's the highest one is tomatoes. Darn it, I love tomatoes. Well, this is why people want to grow their own tomatoes, or why a lot of people now buy organic produce. All of these crops have some cancer risk because they all have some pesticide residue. The Food Quality Protection Act, which was passed in 1996, this limits the residue, the pesticide residues, puts limits on the residue for 9,700 pesticide uses on specific crops. So that gives you an idea that there's a lot of different pesticides being used in today's agricultural world. Limits for all health risks, including endocrine disruption. What is endocrine disruption? These are chemicals that interfere. You know what an endocrine gland is, right? It's like your pituitary. It sends out a hormone that regulates other glands. It's what regulates our reproductive cycle, for example, okay? The endocrine goes to your gonads and regulates your reproduction cycle. Some of these chemicals disrupt that endocrine cycle. And this causes problems with reproduction. It can cause birth defects, miscarriages, and so on. There is a continued use of these chemicals, and some of the companies in our country still make these chemicals that cannot be used in the US. but they're exported and they're used in other countries, such as Mexico, let's say, or other countries that we import produce from. And so you can be getting exposed to pesticides in that way. Food tainted with these pesticides that the companies continue to make and export. Here's a list of what are called persistent organic pollutants, or POPs for short, that were listed at the Stockholm Convention of 2004 and referred to as the Dirty Dozen. They're persistent in the environment. If you look at this chart, you see chlordane used to be the chemical of choice for treating buildings for termites. The first house I built in Austin in the late 80s was treated with chlordane. Chlordane is highly toxic and it tends to get into surrounding watersheds and get into streams, rivers, lakes, and so on. And it's deadly poisonous to anything that breathes with gills, such as fish. Chlordane was banned some years ago, and there are new products now for treating for termites. You see that DDT was banned in about 1972 at the time the EPA came into existence. Polychlorinated biphenyls is a chemical that was used in electrical transformers. And over on Caddo Lake, there is a US Army arsenal that used to use this on their dirt roads to keep the dust down. The PCBs got into Caddo Lake, where they got into the muds. And if there's any dredging or any activity like that, it tends to come into the water. So it's a problem over at Caddo Lake. Dioxins is a byproduct of many manufacturing processes. One of the worst is the making of paper mills. Puts out a lot of dioxin. It's a deadly poison. Okay, so some of you may have been hoping for information that you can use on your own garden, which I'm not really prepared to give you, but there are sources of this type of information. Here's just one that I'm familiar with, Howard Garrett, called the Dirt Doctor. He's got information on natural organic gardening and landscaping for all of North Texas. He's got a website, you see it there. He also has a radio show, and he writes a regular column for the Dallas Morning News. There are many other sources of organic gardening information available. And of course, we also have the Master Gardeners groups. They can give you information. There are other gardening groups who also can give you information, or you can just Google organic gardening. And there you can get a lot of information on how to avoid the use of pesticides. I mentioned one you could use already, which is the use of ladybird beetles or ladybugs to control aphids. If you have a small garden like I have, you can also do quite a good job by simply picking off the insect pests by hand and, just killing them in a jar of water or something. Okay, well, this concludes my presentation. And at this point, we can go with questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. That was extremely informative. We did have one question early on, and I think it was more just a question of a term that you used, economic injury. So is that the result of loss by farmers from pests?
Economic injury, of course, is anything that causes you to lose money, okay. Right?
Yeah.
And so when it comes to big ag, their problem is not only insect pests, but they also have problems with funguses and worms, slugs, and various pests that,
Mhm.
damage their crops and cause a loss of money.
Right.
And at one point, there was a slide that said for every dollar they invested in pesticides or any other side, they saved $3 in crop loss. So
Okay.
that's what is meant by economic injury.
That makes sense. Good. So when you talked about persistent organic pollutants, so does that mean that those pollutants stay in the environment forever, or is there some point where when the elements completely break down and that pesticide is no longer in the environment? Is there any way of knowing that?
Yeah, and of course, forever is a long time, so let's forget about that.
Uh-huh.
Um, some of the newer pesticides that have replaced the old ones, such as DDT, are more toxic, but they don't last as long in the environment. DDT was very persistent in the environment. And of course, it caused many species of birds. What happened with the DDT was it got into the bird. Let's take the bald eagle as an example because it was on the endangered list. So what happened? The DDT interfered with the bird's ability to mobilize calcium and lay eggs with normal shells. So the birds started to lay eggs that had thin shells and they cracked. Just sitting on them made the shells crack. And so, of course, they failed reproductively. And DDT is very persistent. Most of the pesticides that are used today are less persistent. But I mean, what does that mean? I don't know how long there are 10,000 pesticides
Okay.
being used, and many of them, that kind of information does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the best thing would be if we could keep them out of the environment in general and keep them on the crops where they're supposed to be. But of course, that is basically impossible because if you spray from the air, the spray drifts, rain washes it off, gets in the runoff or in the groundwater and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, are you hopeful though that since the newer pesticides are less persistent, that at some point, perhaps there will, I mean, I guess ideally there will be no pesticides, that farming and big ag in general is managed naturally, right? That's ideal.
Yeah, ideal is a good word because that'll never happen.
Right. Yes.
Not as long as we have a big ag. I mean, let's for a minute, let's think about this. Big ag is a result of what is known to ecologists as the Green Revolution. It was brought about by genetically modifying plants so that they're more resistant or so they grow at the right height to be harvested and so on. And that green ag is what allowed there to be so many people on the planet. Now you could say, well, that's a bad thing. It is, unless you're one of the people in the world that, needs to eat.
Right.
So, ultimately the answer is we have less human beings on planet Earth. Now, what is the likelihood of that? Well, actually pretty good. At a certain point in time, human population is supposed to level off at about 9 billion at the end of this century. And it could decline slightly after that. But as to your question about hopefulness, if you look, I mean, the bald eagle is no longer on the endangered species list. It's off because it recovered when DDT was banned from use in the United States. So there may be problems that are being caused by these more short-lived pesticides, but we have not detected them yet. So I guess that's a hopeful thing. I can't name you a species that has, been put on the endangered list because of the use of some of the more new pesticides that are shorter lived in the environment.
Okay. Okay. So you mentioned organic produce, and so do you know, is there regulation of organic produce to ensure that the produce and crops are pesticide free and don't have pesticide residue on them?
Supposedly there is. If you see that stamp, USDA certified organic,
Uh-huh.
that's supposed to mean that they're checking on it
Uh-huh.
and that it is indeed
Pesticide.
organic, which means that there's no use of artificial products
Okay.
in the growing of that crop. Okay, now that's what organic means.
Mhm. Okay.
No artificial man-made products are used
Okay.
in the growing of the crop. And I guess in this country that organic produce is regulated, that's for sure. I don't guess it, I know it.
Mhm.
But how much checking USDA does, I don't know that, but I'm sure they do some.
Okay.
So I think in this country, you can be fairly assured that if you buy organic, and of course it's more expensive
Mm-hmm.
to buy organic,
Yeah.
uh, because normally organic produce is not grown by big ag.
Mm-hmm.
It's grown in much smaller quantities by medium ag or
Mhm.
small ag.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's more expensive to ship and hire and all that because they have to maintain their bottom line as well, right? So it happens to be more expensive that way, right?
Yeah, because if you know, the smaller an operation you run, the cost benefit ratio decreases. You know, there's a smaller and smaller bottom line for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. So you mentioned,
Like, for example, when you have your own little garden plot at the community garden, you know, the produce you're making there is super expensive if you count your own time.
right. Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Super expensive.
Yeah.
But you're assured that it's organic and you grew it yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and it tastes better because of that, right?
Right. Right. You mentioned integrated pest management. Is there do you have a local or a example from the United States where integrated pest management is being implemented or used?
Well, Big Ag uses it, and for information on that, I would send you to the Texas A&M Ag Extension,
Uh-huh.
which I think you're probably familiar with. There's
Yeah.
an office here in Dallas. They what do they call it? They call it, it's agricultural extension, and they have
AgriLife.
agents.
Yeah, AgriLife.
Yeah,
Yeah.
AgriLife, right? That'd be a good source of information on how you could integrate pest management in your own garden.
Good. That's good to know. Thank you for that.
And also they'll give you information on soil. If you need to do a soil test, they can do it for you, and so on.
Okay.
So AgriLife is a good source for anybody growing anything.
That's good to know. So I have a comment from one of our attendees that said she's heard from some people that using Dawn dish detergent is just as effective at killing pests and less harmful. Do you know about that, Dan?
Well, I've heard that you can use it, and it probably works. I've never used it myself, but I would say you could, because I don't know how much you want to have Dawn dish detergent on your produce. I guess it would wash off pretty easily.
Yeah.
I would just say try it and see. It depends on what your pest is, I think, you know.
Yeah. So Dan, you briefly covered this, but we do have a question. We understand that pesticides will, when they're used on crops, can potentially end up in our stormwater and in the creeks, right? So
Oh, definitely.
waterways. And so the long-term effects, talk to us a little bit more about how it affects fish and creatures in the water, basically. I understand it changes their ability to reproduce, right?
It can,
Uh-huh.
yeah. And there was an example of that in Florida, uh, where pesticides they were using on sugarcane. Sugarcane is a very big crop in South Florida. We're getting into the natural waterways, and male alligators were growing up with underdeveloped penises. God forbid. And they were not able to reproduce effectively. In another talk, I have a slide that deals with that situation. And so, of course, they stopped using that. The Florida alligators are pretty important to the Florida tourist trade.
Mm-hmm.
And Florida stopped them from using that, and the alligator population recovered and is now reproducing normally. It depends. Once when I worked in Maryland, we went to a house. I worked with the Maryland Wildlife Administration. These people had a small fish pond in their backyard, and they reported that all their fish died. So me and a couple of biologists went to the house, and we found out that they had recently had their home treated for termites, and the chemical used was chlordane back then. This was in the 80s. And the chlordane had run off either by runoff on the land from rain, or got in the groundwater and seeped into the pond and killed all their fish, because it interferes with the gills' ability to extract oxygen from the water. And anything else that has gills would have the same problem. Some pesticides get down into the mud where they can stay and remain harmless until somebody comes along and dredges, let's say, and all that mud goes out into the water and then gets dissolved in the water and can cause problems with fish and other aquatic organisms.
Yeah.
This happened in Caddo Lake when they were dredging the PCBs that were down in the mud from the Army arsenal over there, got into the water column and killed some fish. So there's a couple of examples.
Okay. Well, I want to give everybody a chance. If you have questions, now is the time to ask. We want to thank Dan for leading us this evening. Our next Eco Talk is February the 23rd, and we will have a Master Gardener leading that Eco Talk, and he will be discussing how we can grow our own vegetables. So this is a very timely discussion. I think we're all interested in finding out more about how to live more healthy and how we can take better care of our planet. And so I want to thank you, Dan, for taking time out of your evening to educate us a little bit more on how to live a little bit more responsibly and hopefully buy organic. Do you have any parting words for us? How can you encourage us to help improve the planet overall, particularly related to pesticide use, and how we can help limit that if it's possible?
Well, I suppose if you're willing to invest the money, buying organic would be an excellent way, because organic food has not had any pesticides or any other artificial chemicals used on it. So that's one thing you can do. This next talk you're going to have should be a very good follow-up talk, because the Master Gardener should be able to help you with this question on your own garden plots, you know, how to be organic
Yes.
and what products there are available for different problems. And I've had a garden plot here in Addison for like 12 years, and believe me, there's a whole lot of problems that come up with these little garden plots.
Mhm.
There are some things I don't even attempt to grow anymore, such as squash, because of the squash borers, you know, get in the stem and kill the whole plant.
Yeah.
And another thing that can be used for some pests is diatomaceous earth.
Mm-hmm.
Diatomaceous earth is the exoskeleton of diatoms, which are little single-celled algae, primarily from salt water. And these algae form a calcium carbonate shell around themselves. And when they die, the shell is left behind. So when you buy that white diatomaceous earth, it's those shells, and they're kind of sharp.
Hmm.
And what happens to the insect is when they crawl across it, it scratches their exoskeleton and they bleed to death.
Wow.
It's an excellent way to control cockroaches because they crawl real low, you know, on their belly. And these shells of the diatomaceous earth will scratch the exoskeleton and they will bleed to death. So that this guy that comes next may have a lot of hints like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. One last question. So for your own yard, Dan, what do you, how do you treat weeds? What's your solution there?
Pull them up by hand.
Yeah.
I don't have a huge yard, so if you've got a weed problem, take that little tool, that weed thing, and just pry them up and get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
You can then throw them in your compost.
Yes. Yes. Good suggestion. We'll also have a composting class this year, so stay tuned for that, attendees. Well, we're going to wrap up now. Dan, again, I want to thank you for your time and your willingness to share your expertise with us. And I appreciate everybody tuning in. You should receive a link to be able to register for next month's talk about growing vegetables with Harold Hannes, our a master gardener. If you have questions about anything related to our Eco Talk tonight, feel free to send me an email, and we'll do everything that we can to get an answer. So thank you again, Dan, and I appreciate everybody attending. Have a great evening.
Okay, thanks everybody.